our opening keynote, his profile's in the book. I'm not going to read it, it's there for you to see. Done a bit of homework on Kim Stevens though, and basically he's been a pioneer in the world of water management. His water balance theory stuff when it first happened, he didn't get pilloried, but he didn't have a whole lot of supporters in what he was trying to do. So like all pioneers, he raised plenty of eyebrows. But like all pioneers who really believed in what they were doing, he kept going with it and going with it. You have a look at what's been achieved and how his thinking now is basically mainstream. I think it's a credit to Kim and his team, and we're really excited about what he has to offer. Ladies and gentlemen, Kim Stevens.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you for the great warm-up in terms of getting this audience. I feel like I'm in Las Vegas, and here I am, I'm on the runway, and you're all kind of expecting some tricks. But I'm not Jay Leno or any of those characters, or whatever. But it really is a pleasure to be here in Australia. And when I first got the email out of the blue, I guess it was from Julie, asking me about whether I would be interested. Of course I said yes, right? Because I'm a glutton for punishment. I never say no. But also I reflected on the fact, and this is the significance of the title, Parallel Journeys to a Resilient Future, and water cycle, because that's the term you tend to use, water balance approaches in Australia and British Columbia, 2001 to 2016. The reason or the significance of 2001 is that in 2001, I was invited to, actually it was the Hunter Valley, to a 3-day local government capacity building session in Newcastle. And it was kind of a critical moment for us because at that point, I came and I talked about overcoming fear and doubt. That was our situation, overcoming fear and doubt in terms of making a major change in how we approached hydrology. We're reinventing urban hydrology. And it was kind of coincident with changes that were taking place in Australia. So it really is good to come back after 15 years and be able to reflect on where we were, where you were, and where we are both today. And and we are moving. All of us are moving in the world. We all are moving towards the same destination, the same goal, but we have our own pathways. I think that's the difference. How we get there is a little bit different. And in terms of, I like quotable quotes. So I went through Andrew's, message from the president in the program, looking for the one sentence that would really capture, for my purposes, how to kick this thing off. And so again, what do you see there? These are Andrew's words. Challenge and change brings opportunity. That was, a phrase I just found embedded in his write-up. And then I looked at one sentence. And so what I've done here is I've underlined the action verbs. So this conference will reach out, right? Reach out beyond the core industry. And that's the significance that when Chris mentioned my question to him about, so what does the makeup of this audience look like? And when he asked you for a show of hands, half the people were coming to your first conference. And the fact that only about half of this audience here are engineers, and you've got a mix. So that's important. So reaching out beyond, engaging with a broader group of committed and talented people. Well, that's what we're all trying to do, and who will need to work together to develop the solutions for the future. So in telling my story or telling our story, because it's not really my story, it's the story of what we're trying to do in British Columbia, hopefully, maybe, you'll do your own connecting the dots and something will go aha, and everybody in this room will have a different aha. And I've often reflected on audiences the fact that, you never know, they'll look at these faces, who will hear something and will go, that speaks to me. That speaks to me. And I will do something differently. Because that's the challenge we always offer to people, or challenge people, which is, what will you do differently when you leave this room today? And that's the significance of when Andrew talked about the call to action. The new normal. You're using that phrase here, aren't you? The new normal? It's become sort of part of the language in the last year for us. And this is a screenshot from the end of the year when I was doing a number of interviews in British Columbia, because Note the caption, drought. Most people think that it rains all the time in British Columbia. Well, it does rain a lot, but drought was a top story of last year. And what surprised me about it being voted the top story of the year is that I thought by Christmas, it was snowing and people were talking about skiing, and the drought had ended in September, October. That I thought the population's memory would be short-lived, but they remembered. And they voted the top story. So something has clicked in the psyche of British Columbians. But coming back to preparing for today, for this moment, Andrew's right. He did give me this long list of names. He generated a long list of names, and we had a number of Skype phone conversations, and we went the list down to these 7 people, and I see that John Argue is in the back of the room there, and I see Peter Coombs. Where's Tony Weber? Tony Weber? I think you're the only 3 that are here. I think the rest of them, I know Bill Till wanted to be here, but Helen, you're here representing WA. And anyway, so these conversations with practitioners, they've helped me see your world through your eyes. And I kind of categorize this as a continuum of perspectives. And Andrew said compare and contrast. Well, actually, I'm not going to compare and contrast. What I am going to do in telling my story, telling our story, our BC story, really try and pick up on themes which came out in those conversations to kind of give you some insight into what we're doing. So again, it's our story. I'm not saying we're better than you or worse than you. I'm just saying this is our story. This is the pathway we've gone down. And maybe there are lessons learned that you can take away from what I say today. But there were overarching themes that came through in those conversations. And the first one was the water balance. And in discussing with my colleagues in BC, what I was learning from the conversations with John Argue and Tony Weber, and we said, we really got to go back to basics here and ask the question, what is your starting point for mimic the water balance? Because we use these words, but they have different meanings to people. And I often, in presentations back home, will say, in elementary school, primary school, everyone learns about the water balance, but by high school, they've forgotten. And yet it's so fundamental to think of those kind of basic concepts. The other question which came out in these conversations, and I have to be candid with you, I'm still trying to wrap my mind around what you guys are doing here in terms of water utilities, because in British Columbia and in Canada as a whole, water is a common good. It's just the way we think, and we resist any efforts to commoditize it in any way, to price it, to trade it, you name it. But you seem to have gone down a different pathway in terms of how your utilities are structured. I'm not proposing to take my time today to get into the ins and outs of that. Just that's what really caught my attention. But in terms of, I do want to leave you with some big ideas today. And one of the big ideas is 20 years ago, 1995, Daniel Pauly, a well-known global fisheries scientist, coined the phrase, the shifting baseline syndrome. How many people in this audience have even heard of that phrase? 1 person, 2 people, 3 people, 4 people. Do I hear 5? No. But and the reason I glommed onto that his work, and actually it was my son who said, "Dad, you gotta watch Daniel Pauly's TED Talk," because 2 years ago I was about to embark on a cross-Canada workshop tour to share our story. And when I heard Daniel Pauly speak to this, I thought that's perfect, because it will allow me to talk to the other provinces about where we are on the curve in British Columbia versus where they are. In other words, we're all different. We're all different points. But what started happening in that process was realizing it's a really powerful image when you stop and think about it in terms of why is it with each generation, we see the world as it is now. And we lack an appreciation for what came before. And you'll see there that what he said was the curve represents a succession of changes. Each generation adjusts its baseline to the new level. And really what he was trying to capture in this very simple graphic was why we allow things to incrementally degrade. So initially he was coming at it from a global fisheries point of view, but as he said, it can apply to anything. So that made me think, what we were trying to accomplish in British Columbia, and why we were different from the other provinces. And what started to come out of this was the fact that about 20 years ago, we made a decision, it seems. It's kind of happened in a way, as part of our top-down, bottom-up approach, that we could reset the ecological baseline. And it's taken us 2 decades to begin, and we're only at the beginning of the journey, but we're beginning to sort of see how we can get there and how we need to change the standards of practice that got us into the mess that we've been in for the last 50 years and actually restore things to a desired watershed condition. And it takes time, and it takes commitment, and it takes perseverance. But we've already begun to see the paybacks, because the initiatives that were initiated in the 1990s, for us, the symbols in the Metro Vancouver region is the orca whale. That's our symbol, and the dolphins. And the last couple of years, they're back. Right? So we've done something right that they're back. And the fact that images on the news of the orca whale breaching, off the shores of Vancouver, the media covered, and it stirs a reaction from people. And in our case, what makes us different from the other regions in terms of the salmon, which is our icon, it's the canary in the coal mine, is that if there's a problem with the salmon, then we have a problem and we need to deal with it. And that's what we've been doing for the last 20 years. So that's kind of my warm-up of the big part of the picture. In terms of the rest of my presentation, really I've organized it into these 4 modules, elaborating on the new normal in British Columbia, Water Balance 101. This is the only technical part, or semi-technical part, of my presentation today, just to go back so that we get on the same page as far as language and what we mean. And then convening for action in British Columbia. That's our mantra. Coming back to what I said a few minutes ago. When you leave this room, what will you do differently? That's called convening for action. And that's why when I first talked to Andrew, I said, what is it you're trying to accomplish today? Is it just to come and have a good time and have a good time, or do you want people to leave and do something differently? And then I'm going to close with sustainable watershed systems. So Chris, that's your cue. So if I better be, with 5 minutes to go, I better be about to start that last module.
I got it.
You got it, okay. So in terms of the new normal, something fundamental is happening. And last year, the drought of 2015, it started on the Mexico-California border, and it moved north. So it moved from California early in the year, the alarms were being raised, into Oregon, into Washington State, and then British Columbia. So normally, from January through to May, it's a wet period. But by April, there was no rain. There was no rain in May. There was no rain in June. There was no rain in July. Finally, at the end of August, there was some rain. So it's telling us that the west coast of North America may be crossing an invisible threshold into a different hydrometeorological regime in Western North America. So it's a fundamental shift. Something's happening, and it's how we adapt to that. Just to kind of give you a sense of comparison, the population of British Columbia is essentially the same population as Queensland. Almost the entire population, as you can see, is concentrated in the southwest corner, 75% of the population. How many people have actually been to British Columbia in this group? A lot. So you have a sense of the Vancouver Island and British Columbia. And so you can kind of see the comparison between here and there in terms of where the people go. picture is worth 1,000 words. 3.5 million people concentrated into a very small footprint. So keep in mind that the length of British Columbia is the same length as from the British Columbia-US border to the US-Mexico border. So it's a big chunk of territory. But we all live in this small pocket, and there's another pocket further inland called the Ecological Basin. But look at that image. As you can see, we've got our backs to the mountains. The red line, do you all see the red line, or do I have to mark it? The US border, the sea, and the fourth boundary we have is what we call the Agricultural Land Reserve. So that was an initiative in 1972 when we had the equivalent of a Labour government coming to power. One of their first acts was to stop urban sprawl and permanently protect agricultural land. It was just a fundamental change in thinking. And you know what? Despite all the changes in government since 1972, nobody has dared to reverse that. Now they do, people do nibble away at the boundaries. That's an issue. But so we've got these four factors, all these people coming in. So what it's done for us, the flip side of a problem is an opportunity. So we're a desirable place to live. So people are flooding in, but the only way they can be accommodated is through densification to going up. So what that is creating is the opportunity to get things right the second time. So it's the opportunity to get things right, and whether we can capitalize on all the opportunities is another question, but at least we have the opportunity. So again, the population is concentrated at the mouth of the Fraser River, and on the east coast of Vancouver Island, it's just a very narrow strip of land housing 3/4 of a million people. So it's a wilderness province. Our climate is changing. As you heard from my examples a moment ago, wetter, warmer winters, longer, drier summers. So the new normal is floods and droughts. Because what's interesting is that on an average annual basis, things haven't really changed. But now we go months at a time without rainfall, and then it dumps. So again, it's that different distribution which requires us to fundamentally change the way we think about water. And I should emphasize too that, now coming here, began to think about the fact that yes, you have multi-year droughts in Australia, and we talk in terms of months, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months. And I thought typically we think our reactions think, well, I guess our droughts aren't significant because they're only in terms of months. But think about it. We've never experienced a 6-month drought. We almost had it last year. We just had enough days of rain to break it in month number 5, and we were well on our way to potentially 7 or 8 months based on our historical patterns. And so what that means is if your water utility managers, if they're slow in reacting, you've got a crisis. And that's what happened last year. There was a slow reaction. So it wasn't until mid-July, when the reservoir levels were plummeting, that we went to stage 3 restrictions. And the question was, would southern British Columbia make it through to the November rains? And it was touch and go. It really was touch and go. It was a region called the Sunshine Coast, another Sunshine Coast, just outside of Vancouver, the Metro Vancouver region. They were within 3 days of running out of water for 30,000 people when rains came. So it's critical. It's critical when we get into these multiple month period droughts. Photograph from a year and a half ago. Normally, that would be a snow-capped mountain and people would be skiing. So in 2015, we had no snowpack, right? So the year of the great drought, dwindling snowpacks, melting glaciers, beleaguered salmon runs, and a costly forest fire season, followed by windstorms and heavy rains. We had windstorms like we've never had. And everything begins to compound because of the windstorms and the long period drought. The trees were falling down everywhere. So we had major power outages because we experienced winds and falling trees like we've never experienced before. So that was how the Vancouver Sun newspaper, which is the major newspaper in British Columbia, captured it on their year-end editorial. So 2015 was a teachable year for change. Is that a phrase you use here, like the teachable moment, the teachable year? No? Okay. We had a previous teachable year, which was 2003, and so I can say, it's not that we're better people or more far-sighted. It's just when you have a crisis, it's how you respond to it. So the reason I'm here today was really because of 2003. When that was, we had it all. We had the four horsemen, right? Drought, which led to forest fires, which led to floods, and then pine beetle, which is our infestation in the forest. So with the temperatures rising by only a degree or two, normally in the winter months the pine beetle would have been, well, it would be dead. But the warm weather meant our forests were being blighted, and then for 2003 the pine beetle exploded in terms of the loss of trees throughout British Columbia, loss of forest. This photograph is a satellite photograph of the Okanagan Valley, which is the second major concentration of population. The reason it's red is because the valley was on fire in 2003 and mass evacuations. I know in Australia you're used to that. We're not used to mass evacuations when an entire town is being threatened. We're talking about a community of 120,000 people. So it was the top story. It got people's attention, and in terms of what I do, the Water Sustainability Action Plan for British Columbia, we were able to capitalize that moment to begin a process which is still playing out today. So when we look at our legacy, our history, well, our past community planning and infrastructure servicing practices, the stuff that used to be considered good engineering in the 50s and 60s, well, the natural balance of watersheds is out of balance. And so what we're seeing then is the financial, the level of service, and the life cycle impacts and implications that are now the drivers for local government action. But what's interesting with our politicians, you can use all the highfalutin language about environment, all that kind of stuff, and people pay lip service, but money talks. And so in terms of the infrastructure deficit, and we call it the infrastructure liability, aging infrastructure, go before councils. When I use the word council, I'm referring to the elected representatives. I know that you refer to the local governments as the council. So they are our elected representatives, councils and boards. It's a simple question. I'm saying, if you know, as you do know, that we cannot afford to replace our core infrastructure, water, sewer, roads, then why would you take on an unfunded liability called drainage and the consequences which don't show up? Why would you double your debt? Because that's essentially what it seems to work out to. Do things differently. So to close out this segment on the new normal, this really quotable quote. I said I like quotable quotes. We're in a meeting and Jody Watson made this observation. It's become one of my main quotes to quote to people, which is, through sharing and learning, ensure that where we are going is indeed the right way. Through sharing and learning. So it's not, this comes back to, I'm going to constantly be referring to our top-down, bottom-up approach. Nobody's prescribing things, so basically it seems like we all have to agree to move in a certain direction before things begin to happen, and the pressure for change comes from the bottom. And I'll explain a bit more about our legislative philosophy in a moment. So moving on to Water Balance 101. I'm speaking in terms of what we're doing in British Columbia because we are different. We are different from the rest of North America. And the reason we're different comes back to our geography. So a couple years ago, I drove across North America, across through the States with my son on a road trip, and it really hit home how topography, geography shapes your thinking. Because when you get, the rest of the continent, it's flat. I mean, they have some rolling and they may have some little bumps, but it's different. The big river systems, but British Columbia, it's mountainous. You saw that photograph, and it affects your thinking because the situation is different. So we have a strong connection to the natural environment because people still remember the 1950s when streams were teeming with salmon. So we still have that connection. People respond to that. And so we have embraced a whole systems approach. The rest of the country, where urban drainage is a priority, their regulatory drivers are still water quality and flooding, and the engineered approaches typically follow US practice. So that's a fundamental difference in terms of how we approach things. So again, in terms of this bottom-up approach, and really the constant messaging, the constant kind of getting what we're doing into a language that anybody can understand, because, you know, the way I've always said to people is the people we ultimately have to reach are those who on Monday nights, because that's our political council nights, elected representatives get together, that audience is ultimately the decision maker, because local government controls land use. So it's not about water, it's not about land, it's about how what you do on the land impacts on water. So mimic the water balance to reduce risk. Yeah, you can think of the obvious thing like reducing flooding, but it's more than that. It's the environmental risk, and it's the financial risk of not getting it right. That's what we're being paying the debt for. And improving watershed health. That's one of those hot button phrases for us right now, improving watershed health. And of course, complying with regulatory requirements. So our goal, kind of to reiterate, is different from the rest of the continent, because we are primarily a mountainous region, because headwater streams are our predominant feature. So yes, you've got the Fraser River draining half of British Columbia, exiting at Metro Vancouver, but we all live in the tributaries, and so we tend to trash the tributaries, because as a young engineer, I was as bad as anybody. You'd say, well, as a percentage of the total watershed, it represents a very small percentage, so there's no impact, is there? Well, of course, what you do then is you proceed to eliminate your prime habitat, which is why in the 90s we had a salmon crisis, where the salmon population literally collapsed, and that was the call to action for us, the salmon crisis. So watershed health is very much about protection of aquatic habitat, but protection of aquatic habitat comes back to drainage and the land development and the erosion of streams. It's an energy question, right? More water running off, more energy, higher velocities, you're blasting out the creeks. But then something happened. And in 1996, in Washington State, Rich Horner and Chris May published their research, which just shook the foundations of conventional stormwater management thinking to its foundation. Because we in British Columbia, we came so close to going down the water quality route based on copycatting what was happening in Eastern Canada and the States. But when Rich Horner and Chris May produced their research, which comes down to the soundbite, which is, if you get the hydrology right, the water quality typically follows along. So the science was the trigger for a change in philosophy. Because what their research established was the roadmap. So in terms of, these last 20 years, linking rainfall, the landscape, stream flow, groundwater, and here's a new phrase for you, sustainable service delivery. I'll come back to that at the end of my presentation. It's been a building blocks process. So reduce runoff volume, mimic flow duration, sustain infiltration, integrate performance targets, downscale targets to a site level, and now viewing water balance pathways as infrastructure assets that provide services. So when we went on that cross-Canada workshop tour 2 years ago, the other provinces would say, well, what are your criteria? Because they're all talking like engineers. I'm an engineer, so I can say that. And we said, well, no, we don't have any criteria because we're focusing on the outcome. What's the outcome we want? Because the challenge we're putting out there is, what do we want British Columbia to look like in 50 years? Because if we want to achieve that condition in 50 years, it's the decisions that we make today that will create that future. So the other part of science-based understanding is it becomes clearer over time. So even my own knowledge, has been like this, because, you fall into the trap of just kind of doing the same old, and then you start thinking about things differently. So it's a process that you have to go through. So inspired by Horner and May, and they were coming at it from the biophysical point of view, they identified, okay, it's the hydrology, stupid, and that led us in British Columbia to say, okay, we've got to go back one step further. We've got to go back to what changed the hydrology. And that was the point where, when I came here, we were overcoming fear and doubt because my fellow engineers, they thought in terms of flooding and peak flows. And so a key to turning things around was demonstrating the achievability of rainfall capture. And that was the essence of what, we were in the early stages in 2001, it was a year before the guidebook was released, of getting things into a language that people could understand, moving it beyond just the engineers to a broader group. And when we look at our rainfall, an annual typical year in the Metro Vancouver region, the south coast on the Vancouver Island, we get in the order of 170 rainfall days a year. You go inland, it's in the order of 110. And so that's the pattern I began to look at, looking for a universal pattern. That's why one of the defining moments for me was John Argue. John shared an observation from one of your colleagues. Remember that, John, about no matter what whether it was Darwin or Tasmania, if you looked at the patterns were universal. The volumes might change, but the patterns, the distributions were universal. And that's what we began to look at, saying, okay, we can actually, if 160 out of 170 rainfall days are less than 5 millimeters, we can manage that. Because that represents the bulk of the rainfall. And about that time, what Horner May were telling us is that it's that critical threshold in terms of impervious area where all of a sudden those innocuous rainfall days were now creating the wear and tear on our channels and habitat. So it was a fundamental shift in thinking from peak flow thinking to, no, we've got to manage the entire spectrum. And I'm probably not telling you anything new, I'm just telling you how we arrived there. So watershed protection starts with an understanding of how water gets to a stream and how long it takes. And this is a fundamental point which we find too few people actually grasp it. So it's part of going back to basics, saying, you have to think in terms of the three pathways: surface runoff, minutes to hours, interflow from days to seasons. And when I was talking to John Argue, what did you tell me, John? He said, interflow is not a word that's in common use in the vocabulary here. Correct, right? He's nodding his head. Yet that's the key. Interflow is the key, as I'll show you in a moment. That's that horizontal layer. And of course, the deep groundwater. So coming out of this slide, guiding principle number 2, maintain the proportion of rainwater entering the stream via each pathway. Mimic the water balance. And this graphic here actually became the core branding graphic for stormwater planning, a guidebook for British Columbia, released in 2002. Because of course, we knew that to deal with the environmental issues, we had to manage at the site, we had to manage at the neighborhood scale. But my engineering colleagues in local government would say, but what about when it floods? And so we said, well, different strategies for different parts of the spectrum. Water balance in a West Coast watershed. No doubt if you plug your numbers in, you'll have different numbers. Kind of like when I talked to Bill Till, and he explained to me that your set of numbers in WA are different again from our numbers in terms of the split. So you got to look at what your numbers are. And so understand where the water goes naturally and reproduce those conditions. So you can see from this table here that in terms of the three pathways, that interflow, it's 55%. And that's the pathway through the 50s and 60s and into the 70s that new development was eliminating. Because I don't know what your practices are necessarily here, but our past practices were to develop a piece of land, you come in and you strip the soil. And then you put the turf down on glacial till, and then you water the hell out of it in terms of the summer months. And then you wonder why, there's no sponge left, right? There's no sponge, so that you're absorbing the water when it rains, and you're slowly releasing it in the summer months. So that was a fundamental shift in thinking. But if the desired outcome is to limit stream erosion, prevent flooding, and improve water quality, then guiding principle number 5 is replicate the flow duration pattern to mimic the water balance. It's taken this long to get to this point. So our epiphany was about 2007. What's interesting right now, there's only 2 other jurisdictions which are on the same page as British Columbia. Washington State, 2012, they embraced flow duration. California, last year. So we're in communication with those jurisdictions right now in terms of how they're implementing an approach to mimicking the water balance. We all use different language. Like in California, they talk about hydromodification. So there's a word you can Google, and you get all the California experience. And Eric Stein's the name to keep in mind. But that's where we're at in terms of the water balance. And there are landscape architects in the crowd. Where are the landscape architects? Okay, over here, over here. Well, I'm glad you're here because in terms of communicating, the rain garden is a perfect way to communicate what we're trying to do. Remember what I said about how are we going to accommodate our growth in population through redevelopment of a watershed? So, we have limited opportunities. We don't have great expanses of land, but we can build rain gardens. One rain garden does not make a difference. Thousands will. So that journey to a water resilient future starts with a rain garden. And I just want to give you the engineering detail because it does come down to an engineering detail and looking at that design of how you implement the 3 targets. For volume, for release to sustain interflow. And here again, we're thinking in terms of, we have the pipe system. All the roads have the pipe. But all those storm sewer systems discharge into creeks. Well, at least we can manage the flow rate of those creeks to replicate a natural condition with a very controlled release and providing an area at the bottom of that collection to infiltrate for deep groundwater recharge. So, same engineering detail, just looking at it differently. And it's probably something most people in this room, all engineers, have done. So, coming back then to the landscape architects, a kind of a key ally, and so the one municipality in British Columbia, which really was a pioneer of the rain gardens, their big aha was, we should team a landscape architect up with a civil designer. Because you couldn't expect the civil designer to do the rain garden. So it took the team, so that was more than a decade. So now this year they're celebrating their 10th year of a rain garden program in a fully built out urban area, and it's a commitment to the long term. It doesn't happen overnight. Convening for action in British Columbia. Our mission, the partnership's mission, develop tools, develop talent, focus on outcomes. So one of the tools you can Google waterbalance.ca. You can Google waterbucket.ca. But really my key message here is that the Water Sustainability Action Plan for British Columbia is being delivered through a partnership between government and a non-government entity, which is the partnership. The partnership is incorporated as a society. Now, I should be candid and tell you that the partnership came about because people in government were on committees and realized that the legacy, the sustainability of the legacy of what we were doing could only be sustained by creating a legal entity. So in 2010, we did incorporate the partnership. So the partnership's responsibility really is the outreach and development of the tools to fill that interface between province and local government and bringing local governments together. I just want to highlight one thing which we found is absolutely critical is our decision to celebrate the work of the champions. So I send out an e-blast every week, a featured story, and we feature the good work that people are doing, and that's what has an impact, to see the good work that people are doing, because that's the key to kind of creating change. So in terms of a philosophy that drives what we do, here's Glenn Brown, provincial government, everyone needs to agree on expectations and how all the players will work together. And after that, each community can reach its goals in its own way. So that is kind of, if you think about it, that's the exact opposite of a prescriptive society, because we're recognizing that not all local governments are created equal. And that you can't tell people what to do, but you can try to guide them to agree on what the vision is and to work together and give them the freedom to reach those goals. Now, I'm not saying we've achieved nirvana, because we do have problems, right, in terms of getting everybody on the same page, but it's a philosophy that we consciously in British Columbia decided to follow, the educational route. So we've coined the expression of the phrase, the regional team approach. And there's always been a regional approach. Our accidental aha was inserting the word team, the regional team approach. And we found that changed behavior. It's a little thing, but it changed behavior to talk about regional teams. And so, partnerships and collaboration. This is our process for moving from awareness to action. We call it, as you see, it's the what, so what, now what, then what. And as societies, we have a lot of trouble getting from step one to step two, because we're very good at saying what's the problem. And again, as an engineer, my career has been defined by floods and droughts. And anybody who's an engineer, and has been around for a long time, know that once a decade there's a flood. You do a study, right? And then it gets put up on the shelf, nothing happens. There's a drought, same thing. So that's the impediment. So the so what can be done, the language we use is design with nature. It influenced practitioners to design with nature. And that's why I singled out the landscape architects and the need to collaborate and partner with the civil engineer. And so, once you get to that stage, now what can be done? And understanding design with nature, well, embrace shared responsibility. We're all in it together. We're all in it together. We're going to learn by doing, classical adaptive management, and establishing precedents. And if you can establish those precedents, then what will then replicate? So that's the cycle that we're in. And so that's the significance of focusing on the champions and those who are doing good work. So to build resiliency, which we're all trying to do, it boils down to two things. What we've been doing is demonstrating what can be accomplished through a regional team approach and encouraging all players in the local government setting. And I emphasize local government setting because it's not just local government employees, to embrace shared responsibility. So regional team approach, shared responsibility, those are foundation pins. Mission possible, we call it. The regional team approach. Look, hey, you can substitute your own words there, couldn't you? Instead of the province, you can put the state, local government. Well, actually, I think I have picked up on one thing. I think we place more emphasis on local government than maybe you do in Australia. That like a lot of countries, like a lot of places, over the last generation or two, there has been a loss of capacity within the senior governments, federal and provincial, and the champions have gravitated to local government. So local government in British Columbia, that's where the action is. That's where your best talent is right now. Those are the people who are driving change. So, but it's more than just local government, right? It's the developers. First Nations, that's our word for Aboriginals, First Nations. And they're an important factor, especially in British Columbia, because our history was British Columbia was the only province where the British didn't have treaties. So we've gone through a process the last 20, 30 years of kind of more than reconciliation. It's really dealing with land claims and beginning to appreciate that the First Nations, which water is a kind of a core part of their society. That's actually a natural alliance between us as about water because they bring the spiritual dimension. I can't talk about the spiritual stuff to do with water because the people would tune out, but they can. So they're very important. And of course, the stewardship sector. And the stewardship sector, that's a key to the bottom up. where the drive has come for change over the last 20 years. And then, of course, the agricultural sector, just like you in Australia, agriculture is a big sector, and then academia. So again, I think this audience, it sounds like you probably represent most of those perspectives, but we call it mission possible. So the partnership, we're responsible for delivering what we're calling the Georgia Basin Interregional Education Initiative. So launched in 2012, so within the Georgia Basin, that's 75% of British Columbia's populations. And so again, it's a case of, like this year, I have to go before the boards and get them to commit. And to be very honest with you, I like it when they pass the resolutions in 14 seconds, because it means it's non-controversial, right? It's a recognition that where we're going is important and necessary. And it's no accident that in our province, two of the top issues in local government studying are water sustainability and asset management. And when we did the cross-country tour 2 years ago, other provinces would say, oh, if only we could get our politicians talking about water like you are in British Columbia. And maybe with all your droughts, you do have your politicians talking about water. But I think this is our lessons learned. So if you want one slide which kind of tells quite a story, this is what's necessary for success, kind of the 10 points. Choose to be enabled. I have to explain what that means, because in British Columbia, local government is the most autonomous of all the provinces of Canada. Most autonomous. And so the culture, the philosophy, which is government things, is that government does not prescribe, government enables. Government provides an opportunity for local government to create things and do what's needed. So when you're enabled, you have a choice. Do you want to choose to do something or choose not to do something? So if I went back 20 years ago, local governments were choosing not to do things. Today we say choose to do it. Establishing high expectations, not lowering the bar, raising the bar. This is what we want. And so it is important in local government to say, this is what we want. Embracing a shared vision, absolutely critical, especially when you're talking about the fact that as your watersheds are redeveloping, you're saying we get one shot every 50 years. We don't get, if we blow it this time, it'll be 50 years before we can fix the problem. Collaborating as a regional team. Collaboration, that word just permeates everything about what we do. Aligning and integrating efforts. Celebrating innovation. That was a decision we made in 2005. We were about to embark on a process of creating, a generic, bylaw and supported by standards. And we convened a meeting of regional engineers in the Metro Vancouver region. And as they went around the table, they started talking to each other, and they started realizing they were doing things. And that's when we realized we had to celebrate what the good works that people were doing. We had to connect with community advocates. It's a powerful combination when you have a decision maker in local government and a community advocate on the same page, co-presenting. It's very powerful in terms of elected officials. Developing local government talent. If local government's where the action is, then you have to have a pool of people who know what questions to ask, right? And to know when they're being told nonsense or good stuff. Promoting shared responsibility. Highlighted because unless everybody buys in from top to bottom, it's awful hard to make things happen. And finally, it's all about changing the land ethic. So it's not about the water. If you change the land ethic, you will change the water ethic. Local governments do learn from each other. They do progress through sharing of case study experience. Hence the weekly e-blasts, the Water Bucket website. We tell the stories of those who are spearheading changes, because what we're trying to do is eliminate the disconnect between information and implementation. We know what we need to do. Doesn't necessarily mean we're doing it, right? And so it's overcoming that disconnect. And this is what needs to happen. Everything's kind of founded on education. That means you've got to be patient. So if you look at that graphic, you can go in either any direction, but it all starts with education. Either you go education to understanding and then follow down, or you go education down through strategic goals. Whatever combination you take, That's what you have to get to action and implementation. So hopefully that's part of what your call to action today is going to achieve. Critical success factors: commitment to take action, champions. And part of what we've been doing is building the network of champions, because with any particular local government, there may only be the one champion. It can be very lonely. So it's linking those people up. Accountability to deliver, the resources to get the job done. But bottom line is inform, educate, and inspire to do better. So to conclude this module, it's taken us more than a decade to implement a policy, program, and regulatory framework that makes possible water resilient communities. And it is key to collaboration. So, our Teachable Year 2003, remember what I told you about there? 2008, our call to action was a former premier, living water smart and green communities. Finally, by 2014, 3 game changes enable action. The new Water Sustainability Act, developed with care in terms of the environmental protection practices. But the linchpin, the thing that's going to drive change, is asset management for sustainable service delivery, a BC framework, because it comes back to funding. If you want the money, if you want the grants, behavior will change. And we're now in the first year of implementation of the BC framework. And that leads me to sustainable watershed systems. I'm awful close to the 5 minutes. We are moving from asset management to sustainable service delivery. Remember I mentioned those words? So it's not about the asset, it's about the service. This is the Deputy Minister's quotable quote from earlier this year: moving beyond traditional engineered infrastructure asset management to also account for nature's services. Come back to the water balance services, the 3 pathways, will help influence standards of practice and represent a leading edge evolution in how infrastructure is planned, financed, implemented, and maintained in British Columbia. We're going the infrastructure route to get people's attention. So this is our new paradigm: watersheds as infrastructure assets. So again, it's an integrated system. I've been hammering that theme to you. The 3 pathways, right? Surface, interflow, keep saying interflow, and groundwater, they are infrastructure assets. That's how we have to think about them. And as assets, they provide water balance services. So if we can, nature provide services cheaper than we can engineer them. So we have a provincial framework. It enables, and I underscore the word enables, local governments to move from understanding to implementation of a whole systems approach that is keyed to the primacy of hydrology. What this shows is my personal timeline in terms of 2002 to 2016, because 2002 was release of the guidebook, so that kind of provides a nice starting point for today's purposes. Of course, you realize to get to 2002, there was a whole other series of changes that took place. So our breakthrough in 2002 was to bridge that gap between the high-level language and on-the-ground practices through a science-based understanding of changes in hydrology. That was the fundamental contribution of Rich Horner and Chris May, and then how we went back to the basics with hydrology. Where we're at today, it's a narrower gap, but it's a tougher one, right? Because we are developing the science-based methodologies and the tools, but it's actually changing the practices. So it becomes harder, it takes a longer-term commitment to get down to the nitty-gritty of the standards of practice. So David Allen, not only is he the co-chair of Asset Management BC, but he's also the CAO of the City of Courtenay, a community of about 30,000 people. And this is kind of his key quote, which is, the role of local government is to deliver services. Achieving sustainable service delivery is the end goal of asset management. So it's a turning around of how we think, because at the very beginning, to question whether you should be building an asset because of the long-term life cycle implications. And what's really interesting about the City of Courtenay, so Courtenay, you might want to Google that name, because what David Allen is implementing right now is a total transformation of the organization built around the principles of sustainable service delivery. So it's quite the story. So in terms of how we're talking about things, we have actually built on your NAM system for asset management. And so when you've got municipalities that are different levels of points along the continuum, first of all, you got to get them to manage their traditional infrastructure correctly. So really what we're trying to do now is get them through the first couple of steps in terms of managing from a life cycle perspective their core infrastructure, and telling them that step 3, integrating natural systems thinking and climate change, get them thinking about it, because we know it won't happen overnight. It'll take us several years, but that's the direction in which we're heading. I'll leave you with this big idea in terms of cathedral thinking, aptly describing our vision for sustainable watershed systems. And in terms of cathedral thinking, I want you to think back to the medieval ages, and we can learn from our ancestors. It took hundreds of years to build cathedrals, didn't it? So 100 years was 4 generations, which means the first people who started knew they would never see the end point. And those in step 2, they too knew that they would not see the end of the journey. So it takes that kind of commitment, intergenerational. It's not about the quarterly report or the 3-year election term. It's having the far-reaching vision of what do we want this place to look like in 50 years, the well-thought-out blueprint, how are we going to change what we do on the land to mimic the water balance, to protect those services that nature provides, so we don't have to spend money on engineering a solution after the fact, and a shared commitment to long-term implementation. So it comes back to education, educating from top to bottom in an organization. That's what David Allen is pioneering in the city of Courtenay. And at an interregional basis, those 5 regional boards passing those motions in 14 seconds because they bought into the concept. They don't have to debate it, that we have to be looking long-term. That's it.